So one of my favorite parts of working at Facebook was that you had this huge diversity of groups within workplace. Pretty much whatever interest you had, there was probably a group of people who were motivated and had that same interest as you. You could talk to them, connect, and that sense of belonging was really powerful, I felt. I'm curious, any favorite groups that you had at your time at Facebook?
Yeah, it's, I found many of the groups to be helpful. There was an E-Sensei group, which I felt was helpful. That was for, I think, level E7 and up individual contributors to connect to each other, which I found a lot of mentorship from, and I learned a lot from that group. I think for a while, some of the social groups were actually quite enjoyable. And that's an example where the scaling function of them over time doesn't work very well. Yeah. But you know what that's like is when like small parties are nice, large parties are nice. Once you get into a group that has thousands of members, it's equivalent to you having like an open party in a park where there are two megaphones on each corner. You know what I mean? The type of person who speaks in a megaphone to 3,000 people, it's a completely different type of person, right? From the type of person who speaks up at a party. So I feel like as the company grew, some of the groups that used to be high sort of signal to noise and high constructive input ended up being just noisy and eventually just contentious. And that's exactly the way you should expect any social interaction to go as you scale the number of people that have the microphone. If you ever open Nextdoor these days, like it's full of this stuff, right? It's like the only neighbors that speak up are the terrible people, right? And so I think similarly, social groups at Facebook, struggled with some of those challenges. Anon managers was an interesting one for individual contributors. Which I totally loved. This idea of building a community amongst those folks is one that when I worked at Microsoft was not a thing, you know? And I think that overall my workplace experience with groups at Facebook using Workplace was so much better than distribution lists at Microsoft, which for the longest time, my entire 12 years at Microsoft, it was email distribution lists were the ways that you discuss things. And you can imagine like that's a super painful, onerous way to run conversation.
Yeah. The two groups I wanted to mention were, number one, Anon managers. I think there's actually a script, right, that would go through, and if you became a manager, it would kick you out of that group. And so it really was, you like had a guarantee that it was a safe space. There were no managers allowed. And the conversation was actually quite deep, right? Because it was engineers only and ICs only. And so like you had this really, you had some pretty deep questions. Well, hey, I'm on a PIP, or like, hey, I'm struggling to work with the manager, or I'm struggling with a coworker. Can you help me? And so I felt like I got a lot of value and learning from just being able to see how helpful people were to the people who posted. And the other one, which I think you also touched on, was there was a group called Let's Fix Meta. Or, back in the day, it was let's fix Facebook, the company. It was a group. A good number of the posts in that group were constructive and they came from a good place. But then over time, I think you get very political and you get in the kind of discussion that you're having because, Facebook has so much impact on the world and people come in with these strong points of view about what should be done. And so, I'm curious about when that kind of thing happens, what is the right course of action? Is to basically clamp down and say, okay, well, we're going to start moderating this group and not have that level of openness. So what should the company do? And is there anything an individual can do if you're at that kind of company?
Yeah, it's a great question. A few thoughts on it. One is if you leave a mic open at a wedding in the front, right, you're in a way asking for trouble. Like, yes, people will say nice things about the couple and whatnot, but as the night goes on and the drinking increases, like the percentage of people that say crazy things that you wish you turned the microphone off for is going to increase. And at some point, the host has to make a hardcore decision, right? Is this open mic night at this wedding, or are we clamping down? So there's sort of a gradient and no right or wrong answer, but I'll tell you the most extreme form that I experienced that I had to personally deal with, which is I was also the creator of an internal product called FB Anon, which was a pseudonymous site meant for Facebook employees to be able to use a version of Workplace that was pseudonymous. So you could never change away from your pseudonym. So your reputation was durable with the pseudonym you chose, but people couldn't discover who you really were. My intent of creating FB Anon was to move discussions that were back then in secret or in blind and places like this that were outside the company to within the company so that company secrets wouldn't be discussed outside the company. right? So that was the intent. And the goal there was to do things like, what would product discussions be like if you didn't know the title or the seniority of the person who was giving constructive feedback about the product, or what would you ask? What types of questions would you ask about careers and how to advance if you could ask them pseudonymously? That was my goal for it. So I created this thing called FB Anon, and it was used by probably thousands of people. Quite active discussions, and things were going fine for a few months, and then as things grew, and especially as election time came around, a lot more contentious things happened. People started to say things in there that I no longer felt was very constructive. There was two levels of not too constructive, in my opinion. One was the constant obsession with discussing salaries and salary ranges. This was like the internal Glassdoor thing, right? Yeah. And I think the trouble with that really is without full context. Like as a manager, I've been a manager and an individual contributor each at least 6 times in my career. So I flopped back and forth, right? As a manager, I'd be more than happy to discuss anybody's salary with anybody, to give them details into why they are compensated the way they are, how peers relative to them are compensated, and why they're compensated more or less than someone else, right? But this idea of a group where you just share like context-free things like, oh, I just got a bonus of $20,000. It's sort of like, well, like an E3 can get bonuses all over the place, so there's no context. I felt like that was one form of like useless sound and fury, right? But mostly harmless, asterisk, right? But I think the worst parts got when people went really ad hominem. See, the funny part with pseudonymy, right, is you can go into a pseudonymous site, but use people's real names to criticize them. So you could be like Flippin' Joe, and I think that VP and then real name is a real douchebag because of X or Y. And like that started to happen more. And I felt like, from a selection bias perspective, the other question is, what sort of thing does a person say when they are pseudonymous? Yeah. Right. Sometimes you say very constructive things, right? But sometimes there's a type of person who uses that pseudonymity to say things that really socially just shouldn't be said or really are not constructive. They just simply don't want the social impact of having been known to have said something that the crowd would otherwise boo off stage. Right. And so in the end, after running that for about 1.5 years, we came to the tough decision to actually shut that whole thing down. And that was, for me, at first, a progressively harder decision, and eventually one where I aligned completely with the senior management of the company and felt like, this monster has grown beyond my original intent and isn't fulfilling the constructive use that I wanted it to have. And so I was very supportive at the end times of shutting it down. But in the meantime, like beautiful things came out. People shared, for instance, how they dealt with their own depression and what sorts of medications helped them, how they dealt with difficulties with family members, things that you just could not say with your real name within a company without feeling like it might impact some of your own career prospects or how people treated you at work. And so I found some of the depression support groups to be very helpful. Some of the ideas that came out were truly pretty good. And so there were some positives, but I do think by the end, I think it was a spigot that needed to be shut off. And now mapping it back to your original question, a company as it grows, at first, real names within workplace are real names and real people. But as you grow to 50,000, 80,000 people, even real names are kind of pseudonyms of sorts because you don't meet the real person ever anyway. Right. And so like you can see how there's an analog there, right? To where once a society gets large enough, you do have to start thinking, what is the right open mic policy?
You just don't have that kind of social connection or that trust maybe. And this is like the inevitable outcome, if you will, of just, a public town square when you get that big.
Yeah. And I might just say that social capital takes time to build, and new people need to be titrated at a certain level for that social capital to retain. Yep. And I think what was hard with Facebook is that Facebook grew to a size that took Apple probably 25 years to grow to, Facebook grew to that size within a record number of years. And so it's almost impossible to have any sort of unified culture or sense of built social capital from the past, that would work once things get large enough. Yeah. Whereas the people who had been there the longest, they do have that social capital and do interact with each other with the civility that you would expect close-knit groups to have. But when Facebook had statistics like in some years, over half the employees were new, and things like this, and it's just impossible to keep things the same at that pace for long.
Yeah.